Today's lecture is going to be on the upper respiratory system, chapter 25. So the first part is the functions. When we're looking at the functions of the upper respiratory tract, we consider this to be external respiration, exchanging the gases between the atmosphere and the blood. And then we have internal respiration, where we actually see the exchange of gases between the blood and the cells of the body. So the upper and lower respiratory system's job is to bring in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. We also have areas such as sinuses, the paranasal sinuses. Their job is to increase the time that the air is trapped in the cavity to help warm, humidify, and cleanse the air from any incoming pathogens. In the larynx, its job is for communication. The larynx is also known as the voice box. Olfaction, the sense of smell, is located in the upper portions of the nasal cavity. And then we have lines of defense. So we have lines of defense in the nasal cavity, such as nose hairs. We have stratified ciliated columnar epithelial that releases mucus in the sinuses and the upper respiratory system. And we also have mucus glands, which secrete lysosomes that help protect against bacteria. So as you can see, it's divided into two categories. We have the upper respiratory tract that's going to end at the pharynx. And then we have, starting at the larynx, dropping down all the way into the base of the lungs, such as the alveoli, the lining or the pleural cavity of the lung, and also included into the diaphragm. So when we look at the structure of the nose, we can see that the nose is actually mostly cartilage. It terminates at the end of the nasal bone and then begins with the septal cartilage. We have dense irregular connective tissue on the outside of the nostrils. This gives us the ability to flare the nostrils to increase the amount of air coming into the nose. And then the passageway, or how air comes in, is going to be divided up by the pharynx. So the majority of the upper airway of the nose is considered to be the nasopharynx. And then we see the oropharynx and the laryngeal pharynx is not only going to share the upper nasal cavity, but also the oral cavity. So in this region of the nasopharynx, we see the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial, mostly for air coming in, and then the oropharynx and the laryngeal pharynx is going to share it with the oral cavity. So when we're breaking down the different regions, the first part we should always start with is going to be the paranasal sinuses. Their job, the frontal and the sphenoid sinuses, is to create airway spaces to trap air to increase the total time that the air is trapped inside of the nasal cavity. This is important because as we bring in air, depending on the temperature, we want to add turbation, which allows for any pathogens to get trapped into the sinuses or the different types of tonsils to prevent any antigens coming into the system. It warms the air prior to going into the lung, and it also humidifies the air prior to going into the lungs. So with the nostrils, we see that the air is going to enter into the nostrils, and there's a series of conchae or ridges located in the nasal cavity. So we have a superior, middle, and inferior concha located, and these ridges again provide for turbination and humidification of the air as it comes in. As the air is traveling through, the meatuses, these areas in between, are just going to be considered the airway pathway. Inside of the nasal cavity, we see our first line of defense, the pharyngeal tonsil, which is located here. This is where we have lymphocytes stored. It's part of the lymphatic system. We also see the opening to the auditory tube. And the upper 1/3 of the nasal cavity is protected from the soft palate. And then at the bottom, we see the uvula. So when we're looking at the next most important aspect is going to be the pharynx region. The nasopharynx is going to kind of terminate right at the uvula or the upper portions of the soft palate. Its primary job is to bring air into the upper respiratory system. But then we have the oropharynx, which is sharing the oral cavity, and it's also sharing the nasal cavity. So the oropharynx has a combination of sharing, or this region can share both the airway coming in from the nasal cavity and the air coming in from the oral cavity. Another line of defense that we have is the palatine tonsil, which is located on the posterior aspect of the oropharynx. And then at the base of the tongue, we have the lingual tonsil, also most important for a line of defense against any antigen or pathogen coming in. And then the laryngopharynx, there's the region where you see the beginnings of the esophagus. And it's important to note with this, we see the first structure, the epiglottis. Due to the mechanisms of swallowing, which we'll talk about in the digestive system, when you swallow, the epiglottis would close to protect any foreign objects entering into the trachea. And then the bolus of food would then be able to travel down the esophagus. And finally, in the laryngopharynx region, we see the voice box or the larynx. Again, it contains the epiglottis. It has a very large area of a thyroid cartilage and a cricoid cartilage to help its support for olfaction and for speaking. So as mentioned earlier, we have 4 main sinuses. Their job is to lighten the skull. They're aligned with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial, so they can first, as the airway is brought in, it can entrap the air. It can provide increased time that the air is located inside of the nasal cavity. Any pathogens that are being caught then can be trapped, and the immune system response can be initiated. The biggest ones that we see located in the maxillary bone are the maxilla sinuses. Then we have the sphenoid, which are located right behind the nasal bone. These small ethmoids, which are the green ones, and then finally the frontal sinuses. So another line of protection and support, and another a line for an increase total time that the air is caught in the lung, in the upper nasal cavity before entering into the lungs. So this is a picture of the larynx. The larynx is located in the laryngopharynx aspect of the pharynx. So a couple of supporting mechanisms that we see is the hyoid bone. It's a free-floating bone. We see the membrane or connective tissue located here. We also see different types of cartilages like the thyroid cartilage and muscular system. So its job is twofold. One, the voice box or the vocal cords are located behind the thyrohyoid membrane, and then also with the muscular system. So it's our ability to have communication. Two, the epiglottis. Its job is to protect the trachea from any foreign objects coming in. Since the trachea and the esophagus share the same laryngopharynx spaces. So when we look at it, the largest cartilage would be this cartilage right here called the thyroid cartilage. It has a laryngeal prominence. It has a receptor site for testosterone, also known as Adam's apple. Most of the time, it's slightly larger in males due to the influence of the testosterone hormone. This area of cartilage has a receptor site for testosterone. The other one that we see, and with the thyroid cartilage, what we see is that in a posterior view, we can see that the thyroid cartilage doesn't actually wrap around and is not continuous. When we look at the epiglottis in a posterior view, we can see how whenever this is activated, it's going to move posteriorly and close off the trachea, which will then allow food to come down through the esophagus, which is also located in the posterior aspect. And then finally we have the cricoid cartilage, which is here. You can see the cricoid cartilage is continuous, so it completely wraps around from an anterior to a posterior view. And its job mainly is to hold the openings up of the beginning of the trachea. And then you can see on the trachea we have these C-shaped cartilages, and the reason why we don't have any cartilage in the posterior view is because the aspect of the esophagus. So the blue lines that I'm drawing here would represent where the esophagus would lie. But the cricoid cartilages, these continuous C-shaped cartilaginous rings are to help keep the anterior portion of the trachea open for breathing. So with the trachea, when we look at the trachea again, we have the thyroid cartilage, which is only continuous. In the anterior view, we have the cricoid cartilage. Again, we have in the posterior view the esophagus, which was running. And then we have these C-shaped tracheal cartilages supported or helps maintain the support of these. As it goes down, the trachea is eventually going to branch off into the bronchi. So we have the right bronchus and the left bronchi. With these, also the trachea, it does have the pseudostratified columnar epithelial with goblet cells that allow for mucus production. So in this illustration, what we see is this is actually a picture of your trachea. So here we would have the submucosa, and then right on the basement membrane, this right here, this would be the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial with the goblet cells that produce the mucus or mucins. So as mucins are produced, the cilia would then move anything that's trapped, an antigen or an irritant. It would then be able to move it with the beating of the cilia to eventually maybe elicit a cough or a sneeze or something to allow it for the irritant to be cleared out of the airway. Thank you, and that was just a very brief structural lecture on the respiratory system.